Thank you, Dr. Donahoe, for coming in and agreeing to participate in this interview. I have a few questions I'd definitely like to ask you. First, what were the events in your own history that led you to become a behavior analyst?
Mainly chance events. I don't mean this to sound immodest, but I think people of ability, paradoxically, chance plays a larger role in their lives than it does otherwise, because they can probably do lots of different things, and so it just depends on the people that they encounter and the events they encounter as to what they end up doing. In my case, I started out as a chemistry major. I was going to be a physician. But I took a course at my junior year in Rutgers with a physiological psychologist whose name was Daniel Lehrman. And it was much more interesting than chemistry. And so as a senior, I switched from chemistry into psychology. And Daniel Lehrman ended up being the very well-known comparative psychologist. He was the editor of the Journal of Comparative and Physiological Psychology, as it was then called. And his only advice to me on going to graduate school was, do not go to a graduate school that is dominated by Hullian psychology. And so I went to the University of Kentucky, which had the lowest tuition, lowest married student housing in the country for an APA-approved program. So those were the criteria that I used in selecting a graduate school. My doctoral supervisor on the doctoral dissertation was James Calvin, who got his PhD with Clark Hull.
Oh, wow.
And so you see, I followed no one's advice. But what got me interested in behavior analysis was there was a Columbia PhD on the faculty who was a very, very nice guy, and but he was not intellectually able to counter the Clark Hull former student. And unfortunately, he died at the summer after my third year in graduate school. And they asked me to take over for him. So I began full-time teaching. I was working on my dissertation in my fourth year of graduate school. And he was replaced by another Skinnerian who had gotten his degree at North Carolina. His name was Fogel Clark. I would say Fogel Clark was primarily responsible for me moving into behavior analysis. And the reason that was so was that some reasons were peripheral. I loved equipment, and I liked all that, those relays clicking and all that kind of stuff. And then I had a psychophysical laboratory that was in a building that burned down. And so I was left with an animal learning laboratory, which was in another building. And so a combination of Fogel Clark and a fire got me to become a behavior analyst.
Interesting. That is quite a story. How were you specifically trained as a behavior analyst?
I wasn't.
You weren't then, so.
No. It was, I was exposed to the standard text, behavior organisms, and so on. But I was really much more exposed to Hullian psychology, which I thought was pretty good. It appealed to my interest in quantitative things, and it appealed to my interest in science. It was explicitly scientific, and it was even explicitly Darwinian, although, as I came to understand later, it was only superficially so. And I was largely self-taught, I would say. The truth dawned on me independently of a mentor.
Well, could you describe those early years in the field, in the community of behavior analysts that were even there?
Well, the psychology department at Kentucky was in the School of Biological Science. And the result was that the program was much narrower than most typical programs. For example, even though the university had a large undergraduate enrollment, the number of psychology majors was only roughly a third what it would have been at a school of that size, because every psychology major had to take calculus. And that eliminated a lot of people. So the students were more science-oriented than they were at many other programs. And so I think I was largely on my own, except for the interactions I had with Fogel Clark. He's a very bright guy, but he had a troubled personal situation, and which limited his effectiveness. But I found him very inspiring, very, very bright guy. So just my conversations with him, I'd say, were the primary influence, and reading on my own. Also, when I first got my job there, I was 3/4 time in psychology and 1/4 time in computer science, and because I was interested in quantitative kinds of things. And so it was just a very gradual move into behavior analysis, because I found out that Freudian, that's interesting, a Freudian slip, no doubt, found out that Hullian psychology, its precision was illusory. That when you actually got into the laboratory and tried to use it, there were so many undetermined variables that it really wasn't a very good guideline, whereas behavior analysis, which took behavior as behavior and not as an indirect reflection of underlying process, that it had something to offer. And the other thing, too, is I had, in those days, you had a major and a minor, even in graduate school. You even had to take the foreign language examinations, and in 2 languages. And I had to take a minor, and the minor I took was in neurophysiology. So I had a fair amount of biological training in addition to my undergraduate work. And behavior analysis fits into a natural science framework better than any other position. So there were a lot of things that moved me in that direction.
Excellent. What would you say would be the most important contributions for behavior analysis? Or what do you think behavior analysis should be remembered for?
Well, hopefully that is yet to be determined. But I would say my own view is this, that behavior analysis in these days will survive to the extent that applied behavior analysis survives. I'm not an applied behavior analyst, but I don't think fundamental, basic, experimental analysis is viable without the applied work. Behavior analysis works, and I would like to see that applied programs would hire basic people in behavioral science with experimental analysis in the same way that, say, a medical school hires physiologists. Because I don't think psychology departments in general for the next N years are going to be very supportive of behavior analysis. I think it's very unfortunate, but I think that's the case. So I would say for the foreseeable future, the fate of the field is dependent upon the success in applied behavior analysis.
What would you consider to be your most important contributions to the field as of this time?
Well, I would say the so-called unified reinforcement principle. It's an attempt to integrate, to show that there's not 2 kinds of learning. There's just one kind of learning, conditioning. And that basic process can be studied using either Pavlovian procedures or operant procedures. Now, there are profound differences in the consequences of those procedures, but the same basic conditioning process, I think, underlies both. And then added to the unified reinforcement principle is an attempt to implement it using neural networks. My belief is that the history of behavior analysis will parallel the history of the acceptance of evolution through natural selection. There was some 70 years between when Darwin proposed his principle and even most biologists got on board. And there were 2 events that occurred that allowed that to happen. One was the discovery of the biological mechanisms that implemented it, genetics. And the second was the development of quantitative procedures that allowed you to trace gene flow and show that natural selection could in fact work as Darwin had described. Now, if a comparable thing develops, in the case of reinforcement principle, which is our counterpart to the principle of natural selection, our counterpart is the principle of selection by reinforcement, then its neural mechanisms must be identified, and we must develop quantitative procedures, such as computer simulation, that show that these basic processes acting over time are competent to produce even the most complex behavior. And I would say the most fruitful area of application right now is to try to do it with verbal behavior, with language.
Did you begin to adapt the selectionist paradigm in your studying of behavior analysis and psychology in general?
It just made sense. It provides an overarching theme for the work. It unites behavior analysis with the other biological sciences. Skinner, although some behavior analysts take exception to this, Skinner said that behavior analysis was a branch of biology, and it unites us with all of the rest of the field of biology, which to me, given my background, was an important thing to do. And also, it's a theme that applies much more broadly. It applies even in physics, for example. I won't go into details, but a lot of the order that you see in physical phenomena is also the result of this selectionist kind of an approach. It's one philosopher of biology said that selection is so simple anyone can misunderstand it, and psychology in general misunderstands the power of this principle when it acts over time. And you'd think that we'd be more willing to accept it because the time intervals over which it acts are so short, relative to, say, the time intervals of evolution. But we don't have the precise knowledge of the development of a child, for example. And so it's very easy for these essentialist kinds of notions, Piaget and so on, to persist, and where we in the absence of direct knowledge of what the selecting events were, we conjure up all these mystical entities to take the place of our ignorance.
Can you talk about that relationship between selectionism and essentialism a little bit more?
Essentialism is the belief that the true characteristics of a phenomenon are inherent to that phenomenon, and that the appearance of the phenomenon is only a dim reflection of what that true essence is. Whereas a selectionist regards the variability that you see in natural phenomena as the phenomena to be studied, that it's not an impediment to understanding the essence, but rather it is the essence. The variability is the essence. And in biology, Ernst Mayr has probably described this most coherently. He talks about the difference between what he calls population thinking, which is the idea that selection operates on a population of events, and contrasts that with essentialism, which is really an old philosophical notion that probably traces back to Plato and so on. The so-called allegory on the cave, where human perception is regarded as something akin to watching the shadows moving on the wall of a cave, where the true events are going on inside the cave, and the fire is casting their shadows on the wall, and all we know are the shadows, and we try to infer from the shadows what the real events are. That's the essentialist position. Whereas, keeping with this analogy for behavior analysis, the shadows are the essence. Shadows are what is to be understood. And it goes throughout not just psychology, but all kinds of fields. The notion of essentialism, that there's something inherent, enduring, constant, universal, that underlies the variation that we see in the world as we experience it.
So you think it's these essentialistic notions in understanding and thinking about behavior that people have used in the past, that is maybe why so many people don't accept behavior analysis so readily? Could you comment on something like that?
Well, I think that's true. This is nothing original to me, but our whole way of talking about the world is implicitly essentialist. We talk about memory, whereas, for example, and from a behavior analytic point of view, memories exist only when we're having them. Now, there aren't any memories that are stored. Rather, what is stored are changes in the synaptic efficacies between neurons in the brain, which, when acted upon by the environment, are capable of producing the behavior. And those same synaptic efficacies might be used in mediating any of a number of different, quotes, memories, any of different behaviors. And so there isn't any memory anywhere. There's only the potential for action that is revealed when the environmental conditions are appropriate. Or, I would say the environmental conditions are appropriate and the person reacts to those in such a way. And there's a distinction in the book that David Palmer and I did called Learning in Complex Behavior between two kinds of memory, what we call reminding, and that's the circumstance in which the present environment contains the events that were present when the behavior was originally acquired, and remembering, in which the present environment does not contain at least all of those elements, and the organism has to behave in learned ways to regenerate the behavior that is scheduled for reinforcement in that situation. That's a much more productive way of viewing, I think, the field of memory than the standard cognitive view of things being stored and retrieved and so on. Because that metaphor leads to all kinds of complications.
How do you think the field of behavior analysis has changed throughout the years through your career?
Well, the basic principles of behavior analysis were fleshed out over, let's say, from Skinner's original work in the 30s up through probably the 1980s. And I think at that point, the basic outlines of the fundamental principles were pretty well established. And my own view is that the most fruitful areas for investigation now are through the integration of work in behavior analysis with work in neuroscience. I think that's where the action is. As I said, if selection by reinforcement is to take the place that I think it deserves to have in the scientific pantheon, it's going to have to be supplemented by knowledge of the biological mechanisms that implement it. This doesn't mean that the principles of reinforcement are dependent in any sort of logical way on that. But I think politically and socially, I think their acceptance is going to depend upon determining what those mechanisms are.
Is there anything in your career that you would have done differently now, given hindsight?
No, chance has favored me. When I was at the University of Kentucky, they put me up for full professor, which I declined because I thought I couldn't move to a better university as a full professor, and so I stayed an associate professor. Then for a year. Then one of my former students got a job at the University of Massachusetts, and he found out they were looking for a position. And I had turned down a job at another university the year before, and I went to the University of Massachusetts, which was wonderful, and I had a wonderful career there. So I think I've been very lucky, very fortunate. I don't think I would change anything. When I went to the University of Massachusetts, I wanted to go there because I thought it was a better situation, and I gave up tenure to go there. And now, in this kind of academic climate, you'd never do something like that. And as a matter of fact, I shudder a little bit when I think of having done it then. But I felt confidence that I would be able to get tenure there. And in fact, they put me up for tenure, for early promotion the year after I got there. So I've been very fortunate.
You spoke about the need for behavior analysis and neuroscience to come together, and the need to do research in that area. Are there any other areas that you specifically see behavior analysis needing to put its energies and efforts?
I'm going to say something that it ought not to put its efforts in. And my belief is that the molar approach in behavior analysis is very unfortunate for the field. What's happened is Dick Herrnstein formulated this molar principle, which is undoubtedly a good description at the level at which it's formulated. But it led, and there were lots of bright, energetic graduate students that promulgated it and have kept it going. But it took our eye off the ball. In other words, Skinner talked about the moment of reinforcement, or sometimes he would refer to it as the moment of truth. And if you try to, let's take both pure and applied work. Let's take basic experimental analysis. What kind of a nervous system is going to work on the basis of the average occurrence of events? By the time you get the averages done, you're dead. You have to work on the basis of, the moment-to-moment kinds of things. Now, any given moment may lead to disaster, but on the average, accumulation of moment-to-moment kinds of events works out pretty well. Evolution shows that, and I think the principle of reinforcement would show it as well. And the second thing that it's done is I think it hasn't had beneficial effects on applied behavior analysis. Let's suppose a child is banging his head on the floor. You say, well, if you do this, on the average, you'll get more reinforcements than if you bang your head on the floor. Well, that's not the way it works. You have to intervene on a moment-to-moment basis in order to get the changes to occur. So I think a movement away from the molar kind of principles will be a good one. That doesn't mean the molar principles may not be important for certain purposes, but you should view them not as the causes, but as the effects of the cumulative action of moment-to-moment kinds of things. And I think the field is starting to gradually move in that direction. This is a little severe, perhaps, but I think what's happened is that if this is the entire variance in behavior in, let's say, choice situations, gradually the part of it that cannot be explained on the basis of the moment-to-moment kinds of events is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And so the molar account is essentially error variance at this point. It's what we don't understand. And I think that over time, the part of the field that requires a molar analysis will be the null set. That we won't need it. But that's sort of harsh, and we'll have to wait and see. But increasingly, you see even the proponents of molar views recognizing that the moment-to-moment kinds of effects have to be understood, that the molar relations are the products of the molecular relations. Just one last thing. Evolution has gone through similar kinds of arguments. And the distinction there is between selection of and selection for. When you select for certain characteristics, you very often lead to the selection of certain other kinds of things. But selection is acting on a set of events that has the effect of producing some overall kind of relationship. But the process itself is operating on a moment-to-moment relation. And the other part of it is that you can't conceive of a nervous system, as I said, that would work that way. The events that go on at a synapse, maybe, let's say, when a postsynaptic neuron is activated by a presynaptic neuron, the compartments that show the biochemical effects of that activation maybe are only active for a couple hundred milliseconds. And I just don't see how you can get from that kind of moment-to-moment kind of thing to the overall kinds of, as fundamental to the overall kinds of relationships that are emphasized by Herrnstein group. I think Herrnstein wanted to to set himself apart from Skinner for reasons I won't go into, some of them personal. And he convinced a number of very bright, energetic people that was a fruitful way to go. And I think that was a great mistake. I think it'll be seen as a mistake.
Where do you see the future of behavior analysis really going? You talked about that a little bit, as getting more into neuroscience, hopefully. But where else do you see the field going, experimentally and applied?
Well, for me, behavior analysis, I think we understand the basic principles now pretty well. And so for me, it will be through interdisciplinary work with people in neuroscience and people in computer science. I'd say it's working in conjunction with those people. That's where the experimental side of the field will go. On applied behavior analysis, I'm incompetent to know where the direction. I mean, look at the amount of work that's going on in autism these days. I mean, if you get rid of all the papers here having to do with autism, it'd be pretty lonely group of people here. And one of the reasons for that is it's supported. And one of the reasons that experimental analysis is having problems is it's difficult to get grant funding for it. For pure basic experimental analysis.
Is there any type of message that you would like to send to future students in behavior analysis?
I would say take comfort in the fact that you're right. That it may be an uphill battle in psychology departments where cognitive science is now the heart of psychology. When I was a graduate student in my early years as a faculty member, learning was the heart of psychology. And it didn't matter what field you were in. You were in social psychology, social learning theory was a big deal. If you were in what became cognitive psychology, you had a lot of people learning lots of things about three-syllable nonsense syllables and trying to relate that in some way to learning. But behavior analysis is not the center of psychology. And but I think if we can make contact with people in neuroscience and computer science, and we can show them the value of the approach that we have, we'll get a lot of support there. And those are fields that have grant funding. And if we can continue to show the applications of behavior analysis, I would say particularly in education generally, not just with people in general say, well, you can use behavior analysis with people that are developmentally disabled or autistic or in other words are not, quotes, quite human. I don't mean this myself. Then that's all right. But if you want to apply it to my kids in normal circumstances, that's treating them like animals. It's all right to treat these other people as if they were animals, but you don't want to treat my children that way. But we have a tremendous opportunity to revolutionize education. But you're not going to get much support from it, from most colleges of education. And you don't get much support for it in psychology departments either. I remember when I used to have a lot of grant money, I would have all of my graduate students pro bono teach discussion sections in my courses. And we used a modified kind of Keller method. And the students did very well. They loved the course, and it was very successful. But as grant funds began to dry up, I couldn't have my students do that without hurting their own careers. And because you get jobs not because you were a good teaching assistant, but because you were involved in research. And so I told our personnel committee that the grades in my courses were probably going to go down because I was going to have to revert to more conventional teaching methods, and I wasn't going to change my standards. And I thought I would get a lot of feedback from the personnel committee about it, but the only thing I got was they were glad that I was not doing this anymore because their students were pressing them to do it in their classes, and they didn't want to bother with it. And I remember Beth Selzer-Azeroff, I taught in our department, and her students were also doing well using these kinds of methods. And she was criticized for giving too many A's. It's going to be an uphill battle there too.
I agree. So where specifically do you see the prospects of neuroscience and behavior analysis coming together? Is it strictly methodological issues that you feel that behavior analysis can bring to neuroscience and other disciplines? What do you feel that behavior analysis' most important contribution could be to other sciences?
Well, certainly our methodologies for dealing with behavior are going to be very important for them. I remember Skinner once talked about when he went to Jim Old's laboratory, he was the first guy who did work on brain stimulation as reinforcement. Old was complaining the data weren't very regular, so Skinner went into the laboratory, and the boxes with lucite balls were sitting out in the room. People were walking by and everything else, and Skinner told them, well, why don't you put them in a sound and light attenuating environment? And he did, and of course the data now became very regular. But here's James Old, one of the major figures in his field, and this is early in his career, of course, this simple, idea hadn't occurred to him. So certainly a methodology, but I think more important conceptually. I think that's where it really, and I'm pleased to see, I don't know, anyone here heard Gerald Edelman talk, and clearly his perspective was much more sympathetic to a behavior analytic perspective than it was to a cognitive psychology question. Someone in the audience got up and asked him a sort of a Chomsky type question about modularity and Fodor and Bever and so on, and he rejected that out of hand, and because it's not consistent with what's known about the brain. Most of psychology is what I call inferred process science. They look at the behavior and try to infer what goes on underneath it. It's what we talked about as essentialism before. And that's doomed to failure. And you can show this even in simple cases. There are quantitative procedures called Markov processes with hidden states. And you can show that, by that I mean there's a sequence of probabilistic events that intervene between the input and the output. And some of those intervening events are observable. And some of them, you can imagine, are hidden, as is the events in the nervous system when you look at it from a behavioral point of view. And people who do studies on Markov chains with hidden states have shown, one, that one can model the input-output relations by a Markov chain whose elements don't resemble those of the hidden state at all, at least within this domain of input and output relationships, and have concluded that it is theoretically impossible to infer the hidden states from the correspondence between the inputs and the outputs. And that's the task that most of psychology has set for itself. It tries to infer what's going on inside from looking outside. And as Skinner said, all that we can ever know about what's going on inside is through work at the level of neuroscience. So I believe we can conceptually contribute a great deal to neuroscience. and including in applied work. For example, human neuropsychology, people that have suffered brain damage. We have so much more to give them than cognitive psychology has. You can ask someone who has had a certain brain injury, move your fingers like this, and they can't do it. So then you say, button your shirt, and they button their shirt. Now, if you're a cognitive psychologist, you say, well, I don't understand this. He has the capacity to button his shirt with those kinds of moves. He doesn't have the capacity to do that. But for a behavior analyst, those are different behaviors under the control of different, the same behavior under the control of different stimuli. That is to say, they're different operants. And so it's quite reasonable that under one set of circumstances a particular behavior will occur and another it won't. Or a simple case like a person who with certain kinds of brain damage might be able to say he feels up today or he feels down, but he can't tell you whether the ceiling is up or down. They're different operants. And for a behavior analyst, the idea that one might have one repertoire and not another is not at all surprising. They're different or the same events under the control of different or the same stimuli. So, but for a cognitive psychologist, does the man have stored in his lexicon up and down or not? It's problematic. Sometimes he has it, sometimes he doesn't. But behavior analysis, those things just fall right out. Skinner's, verbal classifications, for example. You might be able to band or attack one or the other, but not both.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for all.